In the spirit of reconciliation, the Anglican Board of Mission Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. G'day and welcome back to the ABM TARDIS for the fifth in our series of God Was on Both Sides of the Beach Lenten studies. Of course, they can be done in Lent or any time at all. So I hope that they've been, or they will be, a great opportunity for you to learn more about the Torres Strait Islands and the Indigenous Church in Australia. Now here's a confession for you. Last week when I was completing study 4 in our Lenten series, I got to the end and I thought, that's the end. Now there is always more to say, and those of us who are familiar with church of course realise that we do often say more than we need to. But when I got to the end of editing last week's study, I thought, no, I think we've heard the voices. I think we've learnt quite a lot. If we've engaged with the questions, then realistically we've actually covered a heck of a lot of ground, particularly if we weren't really aware of the church in the Torres Strait, the church in North Queensland, the Indigenous church, before we started doing these studies. And so today's study is not a study. Today's study is a challenge. And this is the challenge. What are we going to do now that we know about the church in the Torres Strait, now that we know about the coming of the light, now that we know that the Diocese of North Queensland is struggling to support the Indigenous church, now that we know that there are voices calling out for the acknowledgement and acceptance of the wisdom of Indigenous people, what are we going to do where we are? Because often with a Bible study you can be in a situation where you think, well, that was lovely, that's terrific, and then I go straight back to doing things exactly the same way that I was doing them before. Alternatively, we can actually learn and then act. And that is, of course, an act of mission in itself, and that's why the Anglican Board of Mission exists. Not only to work with our partners within Australia and outside of Australia, with the Anglican Church overseas and internally, but to challenge the Australian Church to engage in mission. So what acts of mission can we do now that we've learned what we've learnt about the coming of the light? Well, as ABM's Education Missioner, I of course want to ask you to consider whether you can support ABM projects with the Indigenous Church in Australia. Now perhaps you already are, in which case, thank you very much, that's fantastic. But perhaps you haven't thought about that. Perhaps you've heard during the course of these studies an opportunity to step out of your comfort zone and to sacrificially and generously support the Indigenous Church in Australia. ABM has a vast range of projects. In fact, in this year, 2021, we're looking through our project book, which you can find on our website, to raise about $400,000 for the Indigenous Church. Now, that sounds quite a lot when you say it. $400,000? Yep, that's a fair bit. But when you think about it, it's not a huge amount of money to support a really important part of the Australian Church. But perhaps that's one of the ways in which your parish, or you as an individual, can choose to support ABM. We need to provide $15,000 for our reconciliation program. We've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mission grants that we're looking to raise $100,000 for. We've got the Gora School, which we're looking to raise $20,000 for. We've got Walkabout Ministries that we're looking to raise $25,000 for. We've got the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Anglican Council, the peak body in the Anglican Church of Indigenous leaders. And we're looking for $12,500 to support them. For the Coming of the Light celebrations this year, as a way of encouraging the Torres Strait to actually speak into the life of the church, we're looking to raise $50,000. For the Diocese of North Queensland, who has oversight, but more importantly, friendship and companionship with the Indigenous Church in North Queensland, we're looking for $25,000. For the Diocese of the Northern Territory, where excellent work is going on, we're looking to raise $36,700. For Noongalina College, which is a fantastic college in its own right in the Northern Territory, $42,750. And for Wantulpa College, the Reverend Victor Joseph's College, the man who you've heard speaking passionately about the life of the Indigenous Church, we're looking to raise $62,500. Now, I know that's a long list of projects and money, and you're probably thinking to yourself, I can't possibly fill any of those needs. But the reality is that ABM manages to fill many of those needs each year through individuals and parishes who decide that yes, this is the time. We want to make a difference in the world. And so I'm encouraging you in your group or on your own, however you're doing the study, to spend this week and next week in the lead up to Easter as we walk the path of Jesus to the cross and the resurrection, to think, what can we do now? What decisions can we make that will make a difference? Now, I recognise that for some of you, this just sounds like ABM doing the hard sell, but it isn't. I was an ordinary Anglican before I was ordained as a deacon and then a priest. I knew very little about the Anglican Board of Mission other than a poster at the back of the church. And yet through working for ABM, I was able to meet, befriend, and be educated by our partners in mission. And when I ask you, can you make a decision to support one of these ministries or one of these projects? What I'm saying is get engaged, learn about our partners and support them, because this is where God is at work in the world, in your life, in your parish, and through our partners in mission. And so yes, I'm asking you to support projects, but I'm also asking you to befriend our partners in mission, because right at the very heart of what mission is the concept of missional friendship. We call it partnership, but essentially what it means is learning about the other human beings who are serving God in the business of mission, in the Anglican Church throughout the world. So, there isn't going to be study 5 and study 6. What there's going to be is this challenge. What are we going to do now? What shall we do now? What can we do now? What will we do now? And that's up to you to decide. There are many ways in which you can engage with Indigenous culture. I've got a few books here I'd like to recommend. This is the classic by John Harris, One Blood. And as you can see, it's not a short read, but if you want to understand a little of the history of the church in relation to Indigenous culture in Australia, it's a good place to start. Marcia Langton, famous Indigenous academic, has written this book, Welcome to Country, and this edition is particularly aimed at young people, which means it's good for all of us. It means we can understand it, it's straightforward, it's clear, and it's simple. You might like to read this. The Bible Society produced this extraordinarily beautiful book, Our Mob, God's Story, and it is a book full of Indigenous Christian art, and yet another example of how Indigenous Christians are contributing to the life of the church, contributing to the theology of the land through their art, through their faith, and through their passion. And of course, ABM has produced A Voice in the Wilderness, Listening to the Statement from the Heart. The Statement from the Heart, now if you don't know what that is, Google it and find out. But Celia Kemp has produced this incredible book, which ABM is enormously proud to support and distribute. You can buy this from us, or you can buy it from bookshops or Amazon. But if you choose, as a parish or an individual, to engage with learning about Indigenous history, and particularly Indigenous history in relationship to the church, this book is brilliant. Celia's done an amazing job, and I recommend it to you. There are some ways in which you can engage with Indigenous culture and make some decisions about what you're going to do. There are, of course, some other things that you can do. Di Langham, a great Indigenous priest, a female priest in the Anglican Church, has made a little bit of a list for herself. She says, here's some things you can do. Discover your local Indigenous people groups and make contact with them with the intention of learning. Ask if there's anything you can do to assist, but don't assume you know what people need. Make friends and listen first, and then see whether you're asked to participate or do anything. She also suggests that you could invite an Indigenous speaker to talk about country and spirituality. I wonder if you've ever done that in your church. I wonder if you've had someone come to speak to you about Indigenous spirituality, about Indigenous Christianity, or about Indigenous contact and understanding of the land on which you live and worship. In my parish, we have had the wonderful opportunity to do that, and it was just an extraordinary gift to all of us. So there's another thing that you could consider. In your worship, and in your pew sheets, and in your communications, and in your social media posts, do you recognise and remember NAIDOC Week from the 4th to 11th of July this year? Reconciliation Week from May the 27th to June the 3rd. What about June the 3rd, which is Mabo Day? Or, particularly in light of this study, July the 1st, the coming of the light to the Torres Strait, the 150th anniversary, which we will celebrate this year in a big way in the Anglican Church, if we choose to. Will you be part of that? Will you recognise these days and these weeks and these moments in your worship and in the life of your parish? This is part of the challenge. Di also suggests that maybe occasionally you leave your parish building, go outside and do campfire church, where people sit around the campfire and they worship and they share stories and they yarn about God and about country and what it means to be a Christian in Australia. Also, if there are local historians within your congregation, find out who your local heroes of reconciliation are. Who are the people who have made a difference, who've stepped outside of their comfort zone and actually embraced Indigenous people and fought for their rights? There's another thing to do. Do you, as a parish, have an acknowledgement of country somewhere written in your church? Do you recognise the land on which your church stands? Because it was not always owned by you. In fact, it was once Aboriginal land or Torres Strait Islander land. Is that recognised formally in your church building? Is it recognised weekly in worship? Is there a statement of acknowledgement of country in your pew sheet? There's something that you can do that's simple and yet profoundly respectful. I've been doing a lot of learning myself. So often when someone presents a study, the assumption is that whoever's presenting really understands and knows a lot about the topic they're talking about. I've spent a lot of time with Indigenous people, both in Australia and across the world, thanks to my work with ABM. And I'm deeply grateful for that, but I am just a beginner. I have to be humble enough to express to you the fact that there are so many things I am yet to understand. And there are so many mistakes that I've made over the course of my life. And yet I pray to God that God's Spirit will lead me and you to a much deeper understanding of where God is at work with Indigenous people. And I pray that you and I will be humble enough to sit and to listen, just as Auntie Rose suggested to us, to sit and listen at the feet of Indigenous people who have come to understand who God is, but in a way that incorporates genuine, authentic Australian culture and an understanding of land and place and ownership in ways that are very different to Western understandings of those things. And so this week, I'm not going to ask you any questions. I've presented you with a series of challenges. Would you like to learn more? Would you like to acknowledge Indigenous people and their relationship with land formally in some way in your parish or in your life? Will you support the projects that ABM is trying to raise money for? This is the question for you this week. This is the challenge which ends this series of Lenten studies. God was on both sides of the beach. What will you do now? Has this just been a nice diversion? Or will you stand with the Indigenous people of Australia, with the Indigenous Christians who are seeking and serving God? Will you welcome their voices as they mission back to the church that once missioned to them? Will we together recognise our Indigenous brothers and sisters as equals and as people from whom we can learn and grow in the gospel?